The ancient walls of Ravencroft Palace had witnessed countless secrets over the centuries, but none quite like what Captain Marcus Thornfield was about to reveal. For 15 years, he had served as the personal guard to the royal family of Valdoria, maintaining his silence through political upheavals, personal scandals, and family disputes. But on this cold November evening, as autumn leaves danced outside the palace windows, Marcus could no longer bear the weight of what he had witnessed. Marcus sat in the dimly lit tavern on the outskirts of the capital city, his weathered hands wrapped around a pewter mug. Across from him sat Elena Rodriguez, an investigative journalist who had spent months trying to uncover the truth behind the growing tension within the royal family. The veteran guard's eyes held the burden of secrets that had eaten away at his conscience for far too long. "You have to understand," Marcus began, his voice barely above a whisper, "what I'm about to tell you could destroy the monarchy as we know it. But the people of Valdoria deserve to know the truth about what really happened between Prince Alexander and Queen Isabel." Elena leaned forward, her recorder hidden beneath a cloth napkin. She had heard rumors for months about escalating conflicts within the palace walls, but no one had been willing to speak on record. Palace staff had been unusually tight-lipped, and official statements from the royal press office had become increasingly vague and contradictory. The story Marcus was about to reveal began 3 months earlier, during what should have been a routine family gathering at the summer residence. Queen Isabel, who had married into the royal family 25 years ago after the death of the beloved Queen Mother, had always maintained a complex relationship with her stepson, Prince Alexander. The prince, now 38 years old and heir to the throne, had never fully accepted his father's second marriage. The tension had been building for years, Marcus explained, taking a sip from his mug. Prince Alexander had always been respectful in public, maintaining the facade that the royal family demanded. But behind closed doors, there were constant disagreements about everything from state affairs to family traditions. The catalyst for the explosive confrontation came when Queen Isabel made a decision that would change the course of Valdorian history. Without consulting Prince Alexander or even King Edmund, she had secretly been negotiating with foreign diplomats about a controversial trade agreement that would significantly impact the kingdom's economy. The agreement, if signed, would grant exclusive mining rights to a neighboring country in exchange for military protection. Marcus had been standing guard outside the private study when he first overheard heated voices coming from within. It was unusual for members of the royal family to raise their voices, even in private. Years of royal protocol and diplomatic training had taught them to maintain composure, even during the most stressful situations. But what Marcus heard that evening was different. It was raw, emotional, and filled with years of suppressed resentment. "I heard Prince Alexander's voice first," Marcus recalled, his eyes growing distant as he remembered that fateful evening. Yes, he was demanding to know why Queen Isabel had been meeting with Ambassador Harrison without his knowledge. The prince had discovered the secret negotiations through his own intelligence network, something that Queen Isabel hadn't anticipated. The queen's response had been equally forceful. She reminded the prince that as the current monarch's wife, she had every right to participate in state affairs. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of royal politics. Queen Isabel had not simply been a decorative figure during her marriage to King Edmund. She had been an active participant in governance, often serving as an unofficial advisor on matters of diplomacy and international relations. But Prince Alexander's anger went deeper than just the unauthorized negotiations. Marcus revealed that the prince had recently discovered something that called into question Queen Isabel's true loyalties to Valdoria. Through careful investigation, Alexander had uncovered evidence suggesting that the queen had been secretly funneling money from royal accounts to support political movements in her home country of Meridia. "The prince had documents," Marcus said, lowering his voice even further. "Bank records, correspondence, meeting notes. He had been building a case against Queen Isabel for months, waiting for the right moment to confront her. The unauthorized trade negotiations simply provided the perfect opportunity." As Marcus continued his account, Elena began to understand the magnitude of what she was hearing. This wasn't just a family dispute or a disagreement about policy. If the allegations were true, Queen Isabel could be charged with treason, embezzlement, or at the very least, gross misconduct in office. The implications for the monarchy would be devastating. The evening of the confrontation, King Edmund had been away on a state visit to a neighboring kingdom, leaving Queen Isabel effectively in charge of royal affairs. Prince Alexander had deliberately waited for his father's absence, knowing that the king's loyalty to his wife might complicate the situation. The prince wanted to present Queen Isabel with the evidence and give her a chance to explain before involving other members of the royal council. Marcus described how he had watched Prince Alexander pace outside the study for nearly an hour before finally knocking on the door. The prince carried a leather briefcase containing copies of all the evidence he had gathered. His expression was grim but determined, like a man who knew he was about to change the course of history, but felt he had no choice but to move forward. When Queen Isabel opened the door, she immediately sensed the gravity of the situation. Marcus noted how her usually confident demeanor seemed to falter for just a moment before she regained her composure and invited the prince inside. The guard had positioned himself strategically near the door, following standard security protocols, but also allowing him to overhear much of the conversation that followed. The confrontation began civilly enough, with Prince Alexander presenting his concerns about the trade negotiations in diplomatic language. But as the conversation progressed and the prince began revealing the extent of his knowledge about Queen Isabel's activities, the tone became increasingly hostile. Marcus could hear the queen's voice rising as she defended her actions and questioned the prince's right to investigate her affairs. The turning point came when Prince Alexander placed the financial documents on the desk. Marcus revealed, "I heard Queen Isabel's sharp intake of breath, and then there was silence for what felt like an eternity. When she finally spoke again, her voice was completely different, cold, calculating, almost threatening." The silence that followed Prince Alexander's presentation of the financial evidence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Marcus remembered how even the ancient grandfather clock in the corner of the study seemed to tick louder in the heavy atmosphere. Through the thick oak door, he could hear the rustle of papers as Queen Isabel examined the documents that threatened to unravel 25 years of carefully constructed royal life. "You have no idea what you're playing with," Queen Isabel finally said, her voice carrying a menace that Marcus had never heard before. The guard had protected the royal family through numerous crises, but this was different. The usual protocol and ceremony that governed royal interactions had completely evaporated, replaced by something far more primal and dangerous. Prince Alexander's response was measured but firm. Marcus could hear the prince's footsteps as he moved around the room, likely standing near the massive fireplace that dominated one wall of the study. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with, Isabel. The question is whether you're going to explain yourself or whether I need to present this evidence to the royal council." The threat was clear, and Queen Isabel understood the implications immediately. The royal council consisted of 12 appointed officials, who served as advisors to the monarchy and had the power to investigate allegations of misconduct. If Prince Alexander brought his evidence before them, it would trigger a formal investigation that could result in Queen Isabel's removal from her position and possible criminal charges. But Queen Isabel was not a woman who yielded easily to threats. Marcus heard the distinctive sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor as she paced behind the massive mahogany desk. "You arrogant child," she said, her words dripping with venom. "You think you understand the complexities of ruling a kingdom? You think your precious principles matter more than the survival of Valdoria?" What happened next would forever change Marcus's perspective on the royal family he had devoted his life to protecting. Queen Isabel began to reveal secrets that she had kept hidden for decades. Secrets that painted a very different picture of the challenges facing the kingdom and the desperate measures she had taken to address them. According to the Queen's account, Valdoria was facing a financial crisis far worse than what had been publicly acknowledged. The kingdom's treasury was nearly depleted, and traditional allies were becoming increasingly unreliable. The money she had transferred to political movements in Meridia wasn't simple corruption. It was part of a complex strategy to maintain influence in a region that was crucial to Valdoria's economic survival. "The mining rights in the trade agreement," Queen Isabel explained with growing intensity, "represent our last chance to secure the resources we need to prevent economic collapse. But those rights come with strings attached. The foreign powers involved demanded guarantees that we could maintain stability in the region, which meant supporting friendly governments in neighboring kingdoms." Prince Alexander's response revealed his own deep understanding of international politics. Marcus could hear the prince challenging Queen Isabel's version of events, questioning why she hadn't involved the royal council in these decisions and demanding to know how much money had been transferred and to whom. The prince had clearly done extensive research and wasn't going to be satisfied with vague explanations. As the confrontation continued, Marcus began to piece together a larger picture of deception and hidden alliances that extended far beyond Queen Isabel's actions. The prince revealed that he had been conducting his own investigation into the kingdom's finances and had discovered discrepancies that went back years, possibly even predating Queen Isabel's marriage to King Edmund. "You want to talk about survival?" Prince Alexander said, his voice rising for the first time during the confrontation. "Let's talk about how your secret dealings have made us vulnerable to foreign manipulation.
Let's discuss how your unauthorized negotiations have already been leaked to our enemies, compromising our position in ways you can't even imagine." This revelation clearly caught Queen Isabel off guard. Marcus heard papers shuffling frantically as she demanded to know what the prince meant. Alexander explained that intelligence reports had confirmed that details of the trade negotiations had been shared with rival kingdoms, undermining Valdoria's bargaining position and potentially exposing the kingdom to economic blackmail. The conversation took an even darker turn when Prince Alexander accused Queen Isabel of deliberately leaking information to create crisis situations that would justify her increasingly desperate measures. According to the prince, the queen had been orchestrating problems to position herself as the only person capable of solving them, gradually accumulating power at the expense of traditional royal institutions. Queen Isabel's denial was immediate and fierce, but Marcus noted that her voice carried less conviction than before. The guard had learned to read people during his years of service, and he could detect the subtle changes in tone that suggested uncertainty or fear. For the first time since the confrontation began, Queen Isabel seemed to be on the defensive. "You have no proof of that accusation," she said, but Prince Alexander was ready with his response. He had documented evidence of communications between Queen Isabel and foreign agents, meetings that had taken place in secret locations outside the palace, and financial transactions that couldn't be explained through normal diplomatic channels. The prince's investigation had been far more thorough than Queen Isabel had anticipated. He had enlisted the help of loyal intelligence officers who shared his concerns about the kingdom's direction, and together they had built a comprehensive case that went far beyond the initial financial irregularities. Marcus realized that the confrontation he was witnessing was actually the culmination of months of careful preparation by Prince Alexander. As the evidence mounted, Queen Isabel's strategy shifted from denial to justification. She began arguing that the traditional approaches to governance were inadequate for the modern challenges facing Valdoria. The world had changed, she insisted, and the monarchy needed to adapt or risk being swept away by forces beyond their control. "Your father understands this," Queen Isabel said, playing what she clearly hoped would be her strongest card. "Edmund knows about the difficult choices we've had to make. He may not know every detail, but he understands that sometimes rulers must act decisively without consulting every committee and council." But Prince Alexander had anticipated this argument as well. Marcus could hear the satisfaction in the prince's voice as he revealed that King Edmund's supposed knowledge and approval was largely fabricated. The prince had spoken with his father before the king's departure for the state visit, and King Edmund had expressed serious concerns about decisions being made in his absence and without his explicit authorization. The revelation that Queen Isabel had been invoking King Edmund's authority without his knowledge added another layer of deception to an already complex web of lies and manipulation. Marcus began to understand that what he was witnessing wasn't just a family dispute, but a struggle for the very soul of the Valdorian monarchy. As the confrontation reached its peak, both Prince Alexander and Queen Isabel seemed to realize that there could be no easy resolution to their conflict. Too much had been said, too many secrets had been revealed, and too many lines had been crossed for them to simply agree to disagree and move forward. The battle for control of Valdoria's future had officially begun, and Marcus knew that he was witnessing the opening moves of a conflict that would reshape the kingdom forever. The atmosphere in the study had become electric with tension, and Marcus could sense that the confrontation was about to take a dangerous turn. Through years of experience protecting the royal family, he had developed an instinct for when situations might escalate beyond verbal exchanges. The way Queen Isabel's voice had changed, becoming sharper and more calculated, suggested that she was preparing to deploy whatever weapons remained in her arsenal. "You think you're so clever, Alexander?" Queen Isabel said, her tone now carrying a coldness that Marcus had never heard before. "But you have no idea how deep this goes, or how many people would be destroyed if you pursue this path. Your precious evidence represents only the tip of an iceberg that you're not prepared to handle." Prince Alexander's response was immediate and unwavering. Marcus could hear the prince moving closer to the desk, his footsteps confident despite the implicit threat in Queen Isabel's words. "Then, perhaps it's time for the truth to come out completely. If there are others involved in this conspiracy, they should be exposed as well." What Queen Isabel revealed next would shake the foundations of everything Marcus thought he knew about the royal family and the kingdom of Valdoria. According to the Queen, Prince Alexander's own mother, the late Queen Catherine, had been involved in similar activities before her death. The beloved former queen, who was remembered as a paragon of virtue and integrity, had allegedly participated in secret financial arrangements with foreign powers during her final years. "Your mother was facing the same impossible choices that I face now," Queen Isabel declared, her voice carrying both triumph and sadness. "The difference is that she died before the full extent of her activities could be discovered. But I have her private papers, Alexander. I have evidence of transactions and agreements that would destroy her memory and call into question the legitimacy of your father's entire reign." The accusation hit Prince Alexander like a physical blow. Marcus could hear the sharp intake of breath, followed by a long silence as the prince processed this shocking revelation about his deceased mother. Queen Catherine had died in a tragic riding accident when Prince Alexander was 22 years old, and her memory had been a source of comfort and inspiration for him throughout his adult life. "You're lying," Prince Alexander finally said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier in the confrontation. The uncertainty was understandable. If Queen Isabel was telling the truth, it would mean that the woman he had idolized and whose example he had tried to follow had been engaged in the same questionable activities he was now condemning. Queen Isabel pressed her advantage, revealing details that only someone with access to Queen Catherine's private papers would know. She described specific meetings, particular financial arrangements, and personal correspondence that painted a picture of a woman who had been willing to compromise moral principles for what she believed was the greater good of the kingdom. According to Queen Isabel's account, Queen Catherine had discovered the same financial pressures and international threats that Valdoria continued to face. The former queen had made difficult choices to protect the kingdom, establishing relationships and making commitments that her son was now unknowingly threatening to expose and destroy. The mining agreement, the financial transfers, even the relationships with foreign political movements, Queen Isabel explained with growing confidence. "All of it builds on foundations that your mother established. I've simply been maintaining and expanding her work, trying to honor the commitments she made and protect the investments she sacrificed so much to secure." Prince Alexander's world was crumbling around him. Marcus could hear the prince struggling to formulate a response as he grappled with the possibility that his entire understanding of his family's history might be fundamentally flawed. The evidence he had gathered against Queen Isabel suddenly seemed less clear-cut if it was simply continuing policies that his own mother had initiated. But as the shock began to wear off, Prince Alexander's analytical mind started working again. Marcus could hear the prince asking specific questions about dates, amounts, and individuals involved in these alleged activities. The prince was testing Queen Isabel's story, looking for inconsistencies or details that didn't align with his own knowledge of his mother's final years. Queen Isabel seemed prepared for this scrutiny, providing detailed responses that demonstrated extensive knowledge of Queen Catherine's activities. However, Marcus noticed that some of her answers seemed rehearsed, as if she had been preparing for this moment for a long time. The guard began to suspect that Queen Isabel might be telling a partial truth, mixing real events with fabricated details to create a narrative that served her purposes. The conversation took another dramatic turn when Prince Alexander demanded to see the papers and evidence that Queen Isabel claimed to possess. The queen initially refused, arguing that revealing such sensitive documents would be dangerous for everyone involved. But the prince was insistent, threatening to proceed with his own investigation regardless of the potential damage to his mother's memory. "Very well." Queen Isabel finally agreed, her voice carrying a note of resignation mixed with what sounded like relief. But understand that once you see this evidence, there will be no going back. You'll be forced to choose between exposing your mother's memory to public scandal or finding a way to work with me to protect the secrets we both now share. Marcus realized that Queen Isabel was attempting to create a situation where Prince Alexander would become complicit in covering up the very activities he had initially sought to expose. By implicating Queen Catherine in similar activities, Queen Isabel was trying to force the prince into a position where revealing the truth would cause more damage than continuing the deception. The sound of a safe being opened filled the study, followed by the rustle of papers as Queen Isabel retrieved what she claimed was evidence of Queen Catherine's involvement in secret financial dealings. Marcus could hear Prince Alexander's breathing become more labored as he examined documents that potentially contained proof of his mother's participation in activities he had always associated with corruption and betrayal. For several minutes, the only sounds in the study were the turning of pages and occasional sharp intakes of breath from Prince Alexander. Marcus found himself holding his own breath, understanding that the prince was examining evidence that would either vindicate Queen Isabel's claims or expose them as elaborate forgeries designed to manipulate him. When Prince Alexander finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "These dates don't match," he said slowly. "Some of these transactions allegedly occurred after my mother's death, and this handwriting, I know my mother's writing, and this isn't it." The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Queen Isabel had overplayed her hand, apparently assuming that Prince Alexander wouldn't examine the documents closely enough to detect inconsistencies. The realization that she had attempted to manipulate him using forged evidence of his deceased mother's alleged crimes sent the prince into a rage that Marcus had never witnessed before. "You forged documents implicating my dead mother to cover up your own crimes," Prince Alexander said, his voice now carrying a fury that made the earlier confrontation seem mild by comparison. "You desecrated her memory to try to escape accountability for your own actions. That is unforgivable." Queen Isabel's response revealed the desperation that had been driving her increasingly reckless behavior. She began arguing that the forgeries were necessary to illustrate a larger truth about the impossible position that rulers faced in the modern world. According to her twisted logic, lying about Queen Catherine's involvement was justified because it helped Prince Alexander understand the pressures and compromises that leadership sometimes required. But Prince Alexander was no longer listening to justifications or explanations. Marcus could hear the prince gathering the forged documents, along with his original evidence, as he prepared to leave the study. The confrontation was ending, but both participants knew that the real battle was just beginning. Queen Isabel had revealed her willingness to use any means necessary to maintain her position, while Prince Alexander had discovered that the corruption within the royal family was far deeper and more personal than he had ever imagined. The aftermath of discovering Queen Isabel's forgeries marked a turning point that neither participant in the confrontation could have anticipated. Prince Alexander's fury had transformed into something far more dangerous. A cold, calculated determination to expose the full extent of Queen Isabel's deception, regardless of the consequences for the monarchy or the kingdom itself. Marcus watched through the study window as Prince Alexander stormed across the courtyard, clutching the briefcase containing both his original evidence and the forged documents that Queen Isabel had used to try to manipulate him. The prince's stride was purposeful and urgent, suggesting that he was already formulating a plan to respond to what he had discovered. Inside the study, Queen Isabel remained alone, and Marcus could hear her moving frantically around the room. She was clearly attempting to secure or destroy additional evidence. Realizing that her desperate gamble with the forged documents had not only failed but had actually made her situation far worse. The sound of papers being shuffled, drawers being opened and closed, and what sounded like files being fed into the fireplace suggested that Queen Isabel was engaged in a desperate attempt to eliminate any remaining evidence that could be used against her. But Queen Isabel's problems extended far beyond the immediate crisis with Prince Alexander. Marcus revealed that the Queen had been receiving increasingly urgent communications from her contacts in Meridia, warning her that the political situation there was deteriorating rapidly. The movements she had been supporting with Valdorian funds were facing challenges from opposition groups, and there were growing concerns that the entire network of relationships she had built might be exposed. She received a coded message that very evening. Marcus told Elena, lowering his voice as he remembered the details. I was responsible for delivering correspondence to members of the royal family, and this particular message came through channels that were supposed to be secure. But the expression on Queen Isabel's face when she read it told me that whatever news it contained was not good. The message, according to Marcus's account, contained warnings that several key figures in the Meridian political movements were prepared to reveal their connections to Queen Isabel in exchange for amnesty from the newly emerging government. This meant that even if Queen Isabel could manage the immediate crisis with Prince Alexander, she would soon face exposure from an entirely different direction. Meanwhile, Prince Alexander was not content to simply confront Queen Isabel directly. The prince had learned valuable lessons about the importance of building alliances and gathering support before making dramatic moves. Marcus revealed that the prince had immediately begun reaching out to trusted members of the royal council, sharing carefully selected portions of his evidence to gauge their reactions and build support for a formal investigation. The first person Prince Alexander contacted was Lord Chancellor Morrison, a man who had served the royal family for over 30 years and was known for his unwavering integrity and loyalty to the crown. Morrison had been a close friend of Queen Catherine and had always maintained a somewhat distant relationship with Queen Isabel, making him a natural ally for Prince Alexander's cause. Lord Morrison was shocked by what Prince Alexander showed him, Marcus continued, but he was also cautious. He understood that moving against a sitting queen, especially one married to the current king, would require overwhelming evidence and careful political maneuvering. A failed attempt to expose Queen Isabel could result in the destruction of everyone involved. The conversation between Prince Alexander and Lord Morrison lasted well into the night, with the two men carefully reviewing the evidence and discussing the potential consequences of various courses of action. Morrison's experience with royal protocol and political intrigue proved invaluable as they developed a strategy for presenting the case against Queen Isabel in a way that would minimize damage to the monarchy while ensuring that justice was served. But their careful planning was interrupted by an unexpected development. Queen Isabel, perhaps realizing that Prince Alexander would not be content to keep their confrontation private, decided to take preemptive action. She contacted King Edmund during his state visit, providing him with a carefully crafted version of events that portrayed Prince Alexander as an unstable and potentially dangerous individual who was making wild accusations against her. According to Queen Isabel's account to the king, Prince Alexander had become obsessed with conspiracy theories and was attempting to undermine her authority through fabricated evidence and false accusations. She claimed that the prince's behavior represented a threat to the stability of the monarchy and suggested that he might be suffering from mental health issues that required immediate attention. King Edmund's response to his wife's call would prove to be crucial in determining the outcome of the entire crisis. Marcus revealed that the king had been experiencing his own doubts about some of the decisions being made in his absence, and Queen Isabel's call served to crystallize concerns that had been building for months. The king was not entirely convinced by Queen Isabel's version of events, Marcus explained. He had noticed inconsistencies in reports from the palace, and he had received indirect warnings from trusted advisors about activities taking place without his knowledge. Queen Isabel's call may have been intended to discredit Prince Alexander, but it actually prompted the king to ask questions that she was not prepared to answer. The conversation between King Edmund and Queen Isabel became increasingly tense as the king pressed for specific details about the accusations Prince Alexander was allegedly making. Queen Isabel found herself in the difficult position of having to provide enough information to make her story credible, while avoiding details that might actually support the prince's case. Her attempts to navigate this challenge were further complicated by the fact that King Edmund was far more knowledgeable about palace affairs than Queen Isabel had assumed. The king had been maintaining his own informal intelligence network, and he was aware of several activities that Queen Isabel had thought were completely secret. When Queen Isabel claimed that Prince Alexander's accusations were entirely fabricated, Marcus revealed, King Edmund surprised her by asking about specific financial transactions that he had already identified as problematic. The queen realized that her husband knew far more than she had anticipated, and her story began to fall apart under his questioning. The phone call that was supposed to neutralize Prince Alexander as a threat instead convinced King Edmund that he needed to return to Valdoria immediately.
The king abruptly ended his state visit, citing urgent domestic concerns, and began making arrangements for his immediate return to the palace. News of King Edmund's early return spread quickly through the palace, creating an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty. Queen Isabel understood that her husband's sudden change in plans represented a direct response to their conversation, and she began making increasingly desperate attempts to control the narrative before his arrival. But Prince Alexander and Lord Morrison had not been idle during this time. They had expanded their circle of trusted allies to include several key members of the royal council, and had begun preparing a formal presentation that would lay out the complete case against Queen Isabel. Their goal was to present King Edmund with a comprehensive overview of the situation upon his return, ensuring that he would have access to accurate information, rather than relying solely on Queen Isabel's version of events. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine not only Queen Isabel's fate, but the future direction of the Valdorian monarchy. Marcus knew that he was witnessing the final acts of a drama that had been building for years, and he understood that his testimony might prove to be the crucial element that determined the outcome. The early morning mist hung heavy over Ravencroft Palace as King Edmund's motorcade approached the main gates, 2 days ahead of his scheduled return. Marcus had been on duty since dawn, and he could sense the electric tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the ancient castle. Palace staff moved with unusual urgency, and whispered conversations stopped abruptly whenever senior officials passed by. Prince Alexander had spent the previous 48 hours in constant meetings with Lord Chancellor Morrison and other trusted advisors, preparing for what everyone understood would be the most consequential royal gathering in decades. The prince had assembled a comprehensive dossier that included not only his original evidence against Queen Isabel, but also additional information that had emerged from their expanded investigation. The prince had uncovered connections that went far beyond what anyone had initially suspected, Marcus told Elena, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed history unfold. Queen Isabel's activities weren't just individual acts of corruption. They were part of a systematic pattern that threatened the very foundations of Valdorian sovereignty. The most damaging revelation had come from intelligence sources who confirmed that Queen Isabel's unauthorized communications with foreign powers had been intercepted by hostile governments. Valdoria's enemies now possessed detailed knowledge of the kingdom's financial vulnerabilities and internal political divisions, information that could be used to destabilize the monarchy or extract significant concessions during future negotiations. As King Edmund's car passed through the palace gates, Queen Isabel watched from her private apartments, understanding that the next few hours would determine whether she would retain her position or face disgrace and possible criminal charges. She had spent the time since the king's phone call attempting to rally support among those members of the court who owed their positions to her influence, but she had found the response disappointingly lukewarm. The king's first action upon returning to the palace was to request private meetings with both Prince Alexander and Queen Isabel, but separately. This decision demonstrated King Edmund's understanding that he needed to hear all sides of the story before making any judgments. Marcus was assigned to escort Prince Alexander to the meeting, providing him with a first-hand opportunity to observe the prince's demeanor as he prepared to present his case to his father. Prince Alexander was nervous but determined, Marcus recalled. He understood that this might be his only chance to present his evidence before Queen Isabel could manipulate the situation further. But he also knew that he was asking his father to confront the possibility that his wife of 25 years had been betraying everything they both claimed to stand for. The meeting between King Edmund and Prince Alexander lasted over 3 hours, during which the prince presented his evidence methodically and thoroughly. Marcus, stationed outside the king's private study, could hear the low murmur of conversation punctuated by occasional exclamations of surprise or anger from the king. The presentation included financial records, correspondence with foreign agents, documentation of unauthorized meetings, and evidence of the forged papers that Queen Isabel had attempted to use against Prince Alexander. King Edmund's reaction to the evidence was both emotional and pragmatic. As a husband, he was devastated to learn about his wife's deception and betrayal. As a monarch, he understood the national security implications of Queen Isabel's activities, and the urgent need to address the crisis before it could cause further damage to the kingdom. When King Edmund finally summoned Queen Isabel for her meeting,
Marcus noted the dramatic change in her appearance and demeanor. Gone was the confident, authoritative figure who had dominated court politics for decades. Instead, Queen Isabel appeared haggard and defensive, clearly aware that her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. The confrontation between King Edmund and Queen Isabel was far more intense than the earlier conflict between the Queen and Prince Alexander. Marcus could hear raised voices, the sound of papers being thrown, and what appeared to be Queen Isabel attempting to justify her actions through increasingly desperate arguments. She tried every approach she could think of, Marcus remembered. First, she denied everything, claiming that Prince Alexander had fabricated the evidence out of jealousy and ambition. Then she tried to justify her actions as necessary for the kingdom's survival. Finally, she attempted to turn the situation into a test of King Edmund's loyalty to her personally. But King Edmund had seen too much evidence to accept Queen Isabel's denials, and he understood the political realities too well to accept her justifications. The king had also been deeply wounded by the discovery that his wife had been conducting secret activities behind his back, undermining his authority and potentially damaging his relationship with his son and heir. The most dramatic moment came when Queen Isabel threatened to reveal embarrassing details about King Edmund's own past if he proceeded with any action against her. This desperate attempt at blackmail backfired spectacularly, convincing the king that his wife was willing to use any weapon available to her, regardless of the damage to the monarchy or the kingdom. King Edmund's response was swift and decisive. He informed Queen Isabel that she would be stripped of all official duties and responsibilities, pending a formal investigation by the royal council. Her access to royal accounts was immediately suspended, and she was confined to her private apartments while arrangements were made for her eventual departure from the palace. But Queen Isabel was not prepared to accept defeat quietly. In a final act of desperation, she attempted to contact her foreign allies and warned them that their relationship with Valdoria was about to be exposed. Marcus intercepted these communications, following security protocols that required monitoring all contacts by individuals under investigation. Queen Isabel's final messages to her foreign contacts revealed the true extent of her betrayal, Marcus explained. She was actually attempting to coordinate with hostile governments to destabilize King Edmund's reign if she was removed from power. The woman who had claimed to be acting in Valdoria's best interests was prepared to destroy the kingdom rather than accept the consequences of her actions. The evidence of Queen Isabel's treasonous communications was the final nail in her political coffin. King Edmund authorized Prince Alexander to present the complete case to the royal council, which voted unanimously to recommend criminal charges against the former queen. The council also implemented immediate measures to secure the kingdom's financial assets and diplomatic relationships, working to minimize the damage caused by Queen Isabel's activities. The public announcement of Queen Isabel's removal came 3 weeks after King Edmund's return to the palace. The official statement cited serious breaches of royal protocol and threats to national security without revealing the full extent of her crimes. Queen Isabel was quietly exiled to a remote estate in the countryside where she would live under supervision for the remainder of her life. Prince Alexander emerged from the crisis with enhanced authority and his father's complete trust. The experience had tested his judgment, his integrity, and his commitment to the principles of good governance, and he had proven himself worthy of the crown he would eventually inherit. The prince also gained valuable insights into the complexities of international politics and the constant vigilance required to protect Valdoria's interests. King Edmund, while personally devastated by his wife's betrayal, demonstrated remarkable leadership in handling the crisis. His willingness to put the kingdom's interests above his personal feelings earned him renewed respect from both the royal council and the general public. The king also took steps to strengthen the institutions and oversight mechanisms that would prevent similar crises in the future. For Marcus, the experience had been both professionally rewarding and personally troubling. His decision to reveal the truth about Queen Isabel's activities had helped save the kingdom from potentially devastating consequences, but it had also required him to betray confidences and expose secrets that he had been trusted to protect. "I knew that coming forward with this story would end my career in royal service," Marcus told Elena as their conversation drew to a close. "But I also knew that the people of Valdoria deserved to understand what had really happened and how close we had come to disaster. Sometimes, loyalty to the crown means being willing to expose those who would destroy it from within."
The story of Queen Isabel's downfall became a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of power and the importance of transparency and accountability in government. It also demonstrated that even the most carefully constructed deceptions would eventually crumble when confronted with truth and courage. For the Kingdom of Valdoria, the crisis marked the end of an era of secrecy and manipulation, and the beginning of a new commitment to honest and principled leadership.